And welcome back. We are about to start Chapter 4 in Book 2, The Chosen, October. From the Essex County Examiner, October 7th. Wendell. The search continued throughout Saturday for 18-year-old Jack Carter, who disappeared a week ago under suspicious circumstances in the vicinity of a condemned industrial site. According to a female friend who was with the Danfield College freshman at the time of his disappearance, the youth was allegedly under the influence of both alcohol and marijuana when he attempted to scale the Old Trestle Bridge, which fords Miller Creek. Though the witness maintains Carter was abducted, Town Sheriff William Nottingham feels a more likely explanation is accidental death and speculates that the intoxicated youth probably fell from the bridge and drowned in the rapids of the creek below. To date, efforts to locate the boy's body in the creek or the neighboring Hadleyville Reservoir into which it flows have proven futile. The underage witness had a blood alcohol level below the legal limit for the state of Massachusetts and tested negative for marijuana and other hallucinogens. Her bizarre testimony is being attributed to the acute psychological distress of Carter's disappearance. Danfield officials have not yet decided whether any punitive action will be taken against the young woman for violating that school's policy regarding underage drinking. The old man in the rocking chair set aside the newspaper and took up his tin cup of chicory tea, swallowing the bitter liquid in a futile attempt to wash away the thirst that had haunted him for more than 100 years. Today, Matthias had added hard spirits to his morning draught, as he'd done every other morning of this goddamn week, in an equally futile effort to forget the boy he'd seen devoured in his own backyard. But hard spirits had long since ceased to affect his wits. Like water on stone, they only darkened the color of his mood, and that was how he imagined himself now, as a stone, a fossilized thing. He remembered once what it was to be drunk, the dizzy thrill of it, but it was a sensation remembered at a great distance, like the memory of happiness. Memories were brittle now, so fragile they fell to dust at the slightest recollection. Only fear remained as bright as the first time he'd tasted it. That first time had been over a century and a half in his past, and it was his father who'd introduced him to it, an even harder man than Matthias. "We're caretakers, our kind," his father had said as he led him through the forbidden woodland path to the old barn. Even as a boy, Matthias had understood that he was to inherit whatever secret waited in that barn, just as his father had inherited it from the father before. Matthias recalled that he had felt a childish pride on that long walk through the woods, perhaps the last human emotion he would ever feel. Moments later, pride was replaced forever by fear, as his father pushed him alone through the barn door, locking him in darkness where something darker crouched. It was Matthias's initiation. Matthias coughed on his chicory tea now, choking on the memory. Yes, the fear was still fresh, though he'd made many trips in the years since to the barn, and no longer was surprised by what slept there. He was due there this morning, and he was dreading it, which was why he lingered over his newspapers. Once he'd been an educated man, and had kept the habit of following the turnings of the world, though he was no longer a part of it. He rocked a moment longer on the porch, the chair's old runners creaking tortuously beneath him. The morning smelled of dampness and impending light, the hard autumn sky softening toward dawn. Just a little longer, he thought, willing daylight to overtake the world. The things in the barn were weakest in the strong light of noonday, but God help the man who met them in the night. Or the boy. The unwanted sight of the week before came again to Matthias, the three of them tearing the boy in two, fighting over the scraps. Matthias had turned away as soon as it began, but no matter how quickly he walked, he couldn't escape the wet sounds of them feeding, the cooing noises the one made, the other's mad cackling. He wished they would finish the boy quickly, or at least take their meal back to the barn. It wasn't the boy's cries that bothered Matthias so much Those were over quickly enough, but rather the sound of the feeding itself. It conjured an unwelcome memory from the dust motes in Matthias's brain of the time he'd served them up his own wife. But he'd had no other choice. They were most dangerous when they were hungry. Fortunately, their hunger came less frequently than a man's, and they were content to lie dormant for whole decades, like the 17-year locusts that had returned this summer. When Matthias sensed they needed feeding, he would buy a few head of dairy cattle and shoo them through the barn doors. The three would be so sluggish with their long sleep he'd have to slaughter the cattle himself and leave the steaming carcasses in the dark. For decades they were content with this fresh kill, but then they would begin to emerge from their slumber, reawakening with an appetite for a more savory meat. If Matthias did not satisfy this hunger, they would begin to venture forth in the evenings to hunt, a risky time when Matthias felt most vulnerable to discovery. He had learned to take precautions to eliminate all traces of their slaughter, and had taken pains to burn the most recent boy's shredded clothing in a pyre out behind the spring house. The last time they'd woken, a century past, Matthias had done what he could to feed them, and so he had led Mary through the woods to the barn, as his father had led him once, though for a different purpose. His wife had thought it a game when he pushed her through the open door into the dark. He'd stood with his back to the plank door, trapping her within, and he remembered how she'd laughed, never knowing that behind her the crouching shadows were stirring. Such was the price a man paid for longevity. Matthias carried his shovel to the barn. For a change, Wendy arrived early for comp lit in Pearson Hall. Even though the gremlin had stalled twice on the way to the east lot, she still arrived at lecture room 100 5 minutes before class. It was easy to be on time in the morning when you couldn't sleep at night. She had been awake and showered well before her bedside alarm clock let out its first shrilling buzz. Not that she was feeling particularly chipper this morning. The last couple of weeks had granted her fitful sleep only grudgingly. The dreams were so viscerally disturbing she felt more relaxed in the wicker chair by her window at night, sitting a silent vigil for the sun. She was walking down the hall, navigating on autopilot, when Frankie Leonard spotted her and plotted an intercept course. From the opposite direction, Alex peeled off from a group of guys with whom he'd been joking and hurried toward her. Wendy thought, amused, that if she stopped short, the two of them would probably collide with each other. "Wendy," Frankie said in a forceful whisper, "I can't take it anymore. It's driving me crazy." "Wendy," Alex said, arriving a split second later on her left, "I want to ask you something." She looked blankly at both of them, twice. "I need more coffee," she thought. "A gallon or so should do it." Frankie placed an arm possessively on Wendy's shoulder. "Ladies first and foremost." Alex nodded, didn't budge. "A little privacy, please," Frankie said. "This is women talk." "Wouldn't want to hear any of that," Alex said. "Must be some sort of gender rules violation." "Yes," Frankie said, grinning wickedly. "Punishable by castration or frontal lobotomy. I guess for a guy it's about the same either way." "Such a die-hard romantic, Frankie," Alex said. "Wendy, I'll save you a seat, okay?" She nodded. The moment he stepped through the lecture hall doors, Frankie steered a yielding Wendy back toward the wall. "I'm dying to know how it went out there, alone, naked in the woods. You and Mother Earth doing your thing. You did do it, didn't you?" Wendy sighed heavily, said nothing. "You chickened out. Geez, I knew you'd never go through with it. Well, that explains it. You've just been too embarrassed to tell me you wimped out." Wendy squeezed by her, but not before she said, "For your information, I didn't wimp out." Frankie's jaw dropped a couple of notches as she caught up to Wendy. "You really did it? Tell me." "Not much to tell," Wendy said, feigning disinterest. "Made a circle, lit a few candles, cast a few fire and air spells. Rather uneventful, actually." "You're joking, right?" Wendy started up the lecture hall stairs, Frankie about as close as a pilot fish on a shark. "Well, it was a brisk evening." "Oh, I'll bet it was, Lady Godiva," Frankie said, soft enough for Wendy's ears alone. Wendy noticed Jensen Hoyt sitting in the back of the crowded class, completely alone with her thoughts. She looked as if she hadn't been sleeping well either. Cindy Sellers had moved to another little clique, and of course Jack Carter was gone, missing and presumed dead. The police thought drugs were involved, but apparently Jen's story included some details that had been far too fetched for the official police record. Between the reported details and the truth of Jack's disappearance was a twilight zone of inner turmoil for Wendy. Somehow she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been involved in Jack's disappearance and probable death. Hadn't she clutched the Tektite stone and performed her banishing spell? Even though she had only wanted him to get off her case, was it possible the spell could have been much more powerful than she intended? She had made it rain, hadn't she? That couldn't have been her imagination, though the days since then had been a confusing mental game involving internal smoke and mirrors and self-deception. Half the time she convinced herself the rain had just been a coincidence. The other half she was filled with doubt and guilt that not only had she altered the weather pattern over Wendell, but also had somehow killed Jack in the process. As Wendy reached the desk across from Alex, Frankie clutched her shoulder and whispered in her ear, "I'm not letting you off this easy, Wendy." It could have been her own conscience speaking to her. Alex smiled at Wendy after Frankie continued back a couple of rows to a free desk. She settled into her desk, and already the pull of lethargy was strong. She glanced at her watch. 9:02. "Prof's late," Alex said. "On exam day, no less." "Is that what you wanted to tell me?" Wendy said, smiling to take the sarcasm out of her words. She couldn't figure out what to do with her hands. Her fingernails were still pitch black, a shade she had often painted them in the past. She had debated covering the natural black with a more girlish shade like hot pink or rouge red, but in the end she thought that might draw more attention to her fingernails than the black they had become. And it wasn't even the black color that bothered her as much as the thickening of the nails, which made trimming them with clippers almost impossible. "What I wanted to ask you," Alex said, "is if you'd like to be my partner." "Your partner?" She was confused, still lost in her own thoughts. "Well," he said, "I couldn't help noticing that moon and stars tattooed on your leg." "Oh, Christ," she thought, embarrassed. "I'm balling my fists to hide these fingernails, and he's staring at the stupid tattoo on my leg." She crossed her legs at the ankle so quickly that he laughed. "No," he said, "I think it's kind of cool, actually." "So did I," she said wryly, "about a year ago. It's just that it got me thinking, about these astronomy lab assignments coming up." "Ah, yes, those pesky lab assignments." "I figured you must have the inside scoop on the moon and stars and stuff," he said, "and I thought these labs would be a little more interesting if we tackled them together." "You did?" "Sure," he said, a little more comfortably into his pitch now. "We have that sunrise and sunset calculation one coming up next week. We could get together this weekend and figure it out." "Well, true, I've got the moon and stars covered," she said, "but the sun is a whole different tattoo. You'll never guess where Bruno said he'd have to draw that one." He grinned. "Well, if you'd rather do it alone—" No, I think we should team up," Wendy said. "I'm not really a morning person, so you could do the sunrise calculations and I'll take the sunset. Fair?" "It's a date," he said, offering his hand, of course, which Wendy dutifully shook. A date, she thought. I like the sound of that. For the first time in her teaching career, Karen was late to class. She arrived 10 minutes after the class bell, flushed and flustered from her breakneck drive to campus. She'd overslept, exhausted after a late night with Paul, worrying about his brother. And of all the days to arrive late to class, it had to be this one. She'd scheduled an essay test on House of the Seven Gables. She dropped the shrink-wrapped bundles of blue exam books on her desk and heard an audible groan go through the lecture hall. As she began distributing the books, one girl in the front row voiced the collective disbelief of the class. "You're not actually still thinking of giving us this test, are you?" "I don't want us to fall behind schedule so early in the term." "But, Professor, you were late," the girl said with an angry pout. "I know, and I apologize," Karen said. "But don't panic. The exam shouldn't take you more than 20 minutes. She fanned out the sheets of exam questions. They could choose any one of the 5 and sent them up the rows. With that accomplished, Karen slumped behind her desk, already exhausted by a day that hadn't even begun. She knew she looked like hell, dark circles beneath her eyes, her hair a lusterless tangle. She crossed her legs on her desk and leaned back in her chair, her notes for her afternoon seminar lecture on Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury propped on her belly. The baby, who seemed to be somersaulting all morning, grew uncharacteristically still, and Karen found herself suddenly alert to the silence, the way you do when a background noise suddenly stops. When this happened, she had an almost eerie sense that the baby was listening to Karen, in a kind of silent standoff between mother and child. Her eyes unfocused as she turned her senses inward, attuned for movement. When did it first happen? Karen thought. When did her unborn daughter suddenly cease to be an extension of herself and become a stranger? And implicit in that thought was a more taboo one Karen hadn't yet allowed herself to speak aloud. When did she first begin to fear the baby? Around Karen, 300 pins scribbled in a kind of cumulative whisper. She felt her eyelids growing heavy. Just for a moment, she told herself, but of course that wasn't a decision for her to make. He is watching, he will come. The dread inevitability of nightmares. His face is lined with deep creases, as if it had been carved up, then sewn back together with a coarse black thread. He wears a waistcoat and linen shirt, knee-length breeches, hose, and black shoes. She knows he is watching with his black, narrowed eyes. The pleasant aroma of bayberry wax on her hands and clothing is a cruel background for the nightmare. But she is a chandler, trading her candles for food, sometimes clothing. And since she has not remarried since her husband's death, the trades are becoming more difficult. She passes the town hall with its row of pillories and stocks. Goodman Osgood stood haplessly in one pillory, marked for the drunkard again, the letter D dangling from his neck. Across the commons, opposite the town hall, is the lofty church. It always pains her to see it. She still attends services on Sundays, but the memory of her husband's death and the church's construction is, at times, too much for her to endure. It is all too easy to imagine that the church scorns her, has abandoned her. She feels the touch of a black breeze that smells like the magistrate, the steady thumping of an unseen samp mortar, pounding corn into a coarse grain, keeps time with her steps as she forces herself to continue on. Thump, thump, thump. Across the commons, beyond the grazing cows, Goody Gable maneuvers her well sweep. Young Timothy Brown rushes by Rebecca, cradling a fire scoop as if it were the Queen's jewels. The Browns always have such terrible luck keeping their chimney fire lit. She wrinkles her nose at the foul smell of wood ash, lye, and burning grease as she passes the Gories making soap over a bubbling, smoking kettle. Thump, thump, thump. The Moody Inn is to her right now. She can never avoid it in the dream, and as her gaze falls on the iron-rung handles, the door bursts open. He is laughing as he steps out. He inclines his head, clasping hands behind his back, and smiles with a rotting charm. She fights the urge to run. "Good morning, Widow Cole," he says, bowing neatly from the waist. "Good day, Magistrate Cook," she answers quickly. She attempts to continue past, but civility is never enough to escape him. He steps in front of her again. "Please, do call me Jonah," he insists. "Surely you are not too busy to exchange greetings with a gentleman of the most honorable intentions?" "Please forgive me," she says, attempting unsuccessfully to sidestep him yet again. Honorable was the last word she would attach to his intentions. He rubs his jaw, displeased with her. "There are rumors, new accusations in this very town. It has been years since Salem. I had hoped Wendell would be spared. Some say a witch caused the burning of Goodman Jones' house." Thump. The samp mortar set the dull, heavy rhythm for her heart. "They say it was witch fire that done it." He pauses for effect. "You sold candles to Goody Jones, did you not, Rebecca?" "Only candles, nothing more," she says, holding her basket of candles close. Thump. "I have heard it said that these fits of yours, these fits of the mind, have brought great ill to Goody Hale's hens." "Goodman Hal says that my fits are merely an epilepsy. There is nothing of witchcraft in them. Goodman Howe is an excellent physician, but guileless in the matters of witches and witchcraft. I know better, Rebecca. Some say the very moment the devil slips into your body to cause these fits, foul things happen. That your fits let the old boy do his work. Do you not smell the stench of brimstone? Sometimes, a foul odor, but there is nothing of the devil in my epilepsies. The stench of hell, I say. The devil come calling, and you his willing servant. Do you not see apparitions of the damned? I know nothing of the devil. They are merely visions. They are the devil at work, and yourself a witch, Cook says. Nothing says the devil's chosen shall always have the face of the hag. I could believe a woman as pretty as yourself might be a witch. Thump. What really caused the Joneses' fire, Rebecca? Your candles or your fits? Are you ready to confess it? Thump. I never. Her breathing has become shallow, the laces of her bodice constricting her chest. She is suffocating, almost wishes for the foul odor that suddenly surrounds her. As you know, it is quite within my influence as a magistrate to, shall we say, dispel certain of these accusations. There are interrogatories, certain tests and examinations. She nods nervously, all words lost to her lips. Her mouth has begun to twitch slightly, her eyelids to flutter. Perhaps you might visit me this evening, to ease these concerns? A thick eyebrow arches expectantly. The pounding of the samp mortar comes within her now, her heartbeat quicker and deafening. His hand reaches out and touches her face with icy fingers. She pulls away and stumbles. The basket slips from her nerveless fingers, and the candles scatter on the ground around her feet. Light flashes around Jonah's face. Black demons articulated from smoke seem to caper above his head, taunting her. Voices whisper urgent nonsense into her ears. Jonah's hands reach out to her, but instead of helping her, he seems to be pushing her down. She falls with a gasp. Fear clenches her stomach. The seizure pulls her down into a helpless darkness, and she is hardly aware as people begin to gather around her, where she lies in the dirt, twitching and trembling. They look to one another, darting glances, looking for something fearful they expect to happen. Rebecca Cole is in a seizure. It is not then that strange, foul deeds happen. Wither pushes through the crowd toward the prone woman. Jonah Cook, the troublesome magistrate, stands over the spectacle, a look of disgust on his face, not the slightest inclination to help. She does not doubt his unwanted attentions are somehow at the root of Rebecca's fit. Move, all of you! Wither kneels at Rebecca Cole's side and sneers up at them, finally setting on Jonah Cook. You would stand here and do nothing for her? Cook clears his throat. I had planned to find Dr. Howell. A plan long in its execution, then, Wither says disdainfully. Her hands move swiftly over Rebecca's body, seeking. Finally, her hands settle around the thrashing woman's face, grip it tightly. She burns brightly, this one, Wither says softly. Her mind burns, like to burn itself out. Suddenly the convulsions stop. The devil's own work, Cook says, his voice thick with fear. You took the spell away, the very same spell you must have placed yourself. You are a witch. Nonsense, Wither says, but smiles at his discomfort. Rebecca's strained muscles relax and her face becomes peaceful. Her eyes flutter open and slowly focus. She stares first at the sky, then at the strange woman who cradles her head in her lap. The samp mortar is suddenly still, and Rebecca says with a touch of awe, Widow. Karen's eyes snapped open. She saw distant lozenges of institutional light and realized she was looking directly up at the fluorescent lighting of the lecture hall. A face was nearby, just outside her frame of vision, speaking. Professor, can you hear me? The voice was distorted, as if traveling through water. Wendy. Recognition came after a disorienting delay. Wendy was crouching down on the floor beside her, holding Karen's hand. In a circle at a safe distance away stood more students, looking wary, as if what Karen had might be catching. Karen tried to rise. Wendy put a firm hand to her shoulder. Maybe you should lie still for a second. We've called for campus security. They're sending an ambulance. Karen sat up anyway, her head throbbing. Through her hair she felt an angry knot at the base of her skull. She tasted the coppery tang of blood. What happened? She asked Wendy. I think you had a seizure. You made a noise like a groan and flipped out of your chair onto the floor. She took a clean tissue from her purse and touched it gently to Karen's lip. It came back bloody. I think you might have bitten your tongue. How long was I unconscious? Maybe 30 seconds, Wendy said, speaking quietly. That's all, Karen said. Seemed plenty long enough, Wendy said, and Karen could see the girl was concerned. Karen looked into her student's eyes and had the strangest feeling of déjà vu, the present as flashbulb afterimage of a dream or a past memory. Art woke to antiseptic light and an out-of-kilter world. The right side of his face felt sore and lopsided, and when he lifted a hand instinctively to the bandages, he saw intravenous lines trailing from the back of his hand. My eye, he said, feeling a dread sinking in his chest. A voice told him, Don't worry, you still have them both. Art turned in the direction of the man who'd spoken. He was standing in Art's temporary blind spot, in the doorway of the private hospital suite. Sheriff Bill Nottingham was Art's age and twice his size, big across the chest and shoulders, with the hand-dog expression of a man with teenage daughters. They'd gone to Harrison High School together, though of course they'd run in different crowds, Bill captaining the swim team while Art engineered the perfect bong. What do you remember? The sheriff asked, taking Art's return to consciousness as an invitation to enter. Being prepped for surgery, Art said. Before that. There was a plastic cup of water on the bedside table, and Art sipped it. You mean the accident? He frowned, tried to bring it back into focus. Isn't much there, just fragments. Hitting my head on the steering, and the paramedics. He shook his head and instantly regretted it. He looked at the sheriff, now standing at the foot of his bed. Tried a smile. Christ, Bill, I don't think we've spoken since high school. This isn't a reunion, the sheriff said flatly. I've got questions to ask. I'd like to get the answers to them now, but I'll come back if you're not ready. Art chilled at his tone. My God, the little girl. Is she dead? The sheriff's expression tightened, controlling any show of emotion beyond the professional. Her neck is broken. She'll never walk again. Quadriplegic. Art felt the room swoon sickeningly around him. He clutched the cold steel bed rails to steady himself. Worse than dead. The sheriff watched Art's reaction through clinically cool eyes. When Art began to speak again, they narrowed to slits. I remember she had some kind of fit. She attacked me. The sheriff held up a hand. I want to hear this, all of it, but I have to tell you before you say any more that you have the right to remain silent. Art looked at him in surprise while he delivered his Miranda monologue. I'm under arrest? What do you understand your rights as I've described them to you? He glared at Art. Art's mouth was dry, so he only nodded. When did your relationship with Abby McNeil begin? He gave the word relationship special emphasis. But I'd just found her in the woods. She was unconscious. When? A half hour before the accident. I never saw her before that. He was confused, put on the defensive by the cop's accusation tone. The car wreck was an accident, Bill. I lost control when she attacked me. You see what she did to my eye. The sheriff's jaw tightened again. He crossed his arms and his jacket opened, revealing a service Glock and handcuffs. When he spoke again, it was a deadly whisper. You keep pissing in my face like this, we're going to have a serious problem. Now, I'll give you one more chance to tell me how long you've been doing this to the little girl. Doing? Art felt tears of frustration well up in his one good eye. I told you, I just found her a half hour before the accident. Bullshit! The cop was trembling with restrained fury. Listen to me, Leeson. All we've got you on now is reckless endangerment of a minor. It isn't much, but it's enough to hold you until we can make this more serious charges stick, and I will make them stick. Serious charges? Well, what am I suspected of? Kidnapping, attempted rape? The words hit Art like a slap. My God, no! They thought he was some kind of child predator. That's right, Art, the sheriff said. While you're lying there healing, you just think about what you've done to her. Art was too numb to protest. He couldn't shake the memory of the little girl asleep on the witches' graves. He said weakly, Does she remember anything? She won't speak. She's in post-traumatic shock. No one can help her now. He'd spent all his rage and was left now only with a weary sadness. He hesitated at the door to Art's hospital room. Only you. You can do one thing right by this little girl. Accept responsibility for what you've done to her. On his way down from the Perp's fifth-floor hospital room, Sheriff Bill Nottingham stopped off at the pediatric intensive care unit to check on the little girl. He found the child's father at the nurse's station, flirting with one of the RNs. Randy McNeil, 29, had problems with Massachusetts open container laws. Nottingham had personally administered field sobriety tests on 2 occasions to the younger man, the second resulting in a DUI conviction. It was to this prior confrontation that the sheriff attributed McNeil's discomfort now whenever they were alone together. The sheriff tipped his head in silent greeting to McNeil, who looked stricken at the sight of the police officer approaching from the elevators. How you holding up? The sheriff asked and put a hand on McNeil's shoulder. The young father startled at the sheriff's touch. You know, he gave an equally vague shrug, like a kid called on the carpet by his guidance counselor. He hadn't shaved, and his red whiskers were coming in patchy, like a rash. You mind if I look in on her? Randy McNeil looked relieved. Yeah, sure, go ahead. I think she's awake. He waved his hand vaguely in the direction of his daughter's room. The sheriff nodded and continued past the nurse's station, steeling himself for the sight of the little girl. A father himself, he dreaded these moments when the random ugliness of the world chose a child for its victim. He put a hand on the plexiglass partition that separated Abby's area from the rest of the ICU pod and looked in. She was lying on her back on a special hospital bed designed to prevent bed sores in a paralyzed patient. The heart monitor chirped quietly from its mechanical stand behind her. There had been some concern at first that her spinal cord had been severed so high up that she would lose all automation functions and require a respirator for the rest of her life to do her breathing for her. Thank God for small miracles, Sheriff Nottingham thought now, as he noticed that she'd been taken off the ventilator since his last visit. Randy McNeil had been wrong about his daughter. She wasn't awake. In fact, the little girl was deep into REM sleep, her eyes scanning left to right rapidly behind closed lids. She was dreaming. Sarah Hutchins slides the warming pan under the linen sheets of the single-post jack bed. The embers in the copper pan warm the bed while the ale her husband drinks from his tankard warms his stomach. The ale, however, will produce a fatal heart from which he will not escape. He will take that secret to his grave. The ale, however, will produce a fatal heat from which he will not escape. He will take that secret to his grave. Her arms ache with each movement of the warming pan. The bruises along her arm and ribs have faded to yellow. 3 days have passed since the last beating, enough time to give her the courage to administer the poison Elizabeth has given her. Even though she has been waiting for the sound, it still startles her. The wooden tanker falling over, ale spilling out, spreading over the long table with a wet, gurgling rush. A moment later, his head strikes the table. She places the warming pan carefully on the floor. Roland, she calls, afraid to turn, afraid that he has found her out and is playing along to reveal her treachery. Roland? Sarah turns slowly, conscious that she was holding her breath. Now her fate is truly cast with Elizabeth and Rebecca. She whispers to herself, there is no one else now. Moonlight shines through the triangular-shaped window panes of leaded glass, lighting the floor of the keeping room in a pattern like arrowheads on her husband's back. The flames in the fireplace and lantern seem stirred to urgency, impatient for her to finish her task, as if they are emissaries of the devil come to oversee her sin. The worst is over, she says, but all is not yet done. He wears his looped jerkin, deer-hide breeches tied at the knee, and knitted wool stockings. He has been still and silent since his head fell to the table, not snoring, as the poison has taken him to a deeper place than sleep, where the blackness of his mind matches the blackness of his heart. She wraps her hands under his arms, grips the cloth of his vest, and pulls him back from the bench. He is a big man, and she struggles with the weight. "Take your time," she whispers. "You have all of the night to make it complete." Her knees buckle under his weight, and she falls back, banging her head against the hardwood floor. She squirms out from beneath him. "Even in death you have the power to abuse me." She looks at the window, expecting half the town to be staring back at her. Bent into a crouch, she pulls him across the floor, her fingernails biting into the cloth of his jerkin. "Did you think I would ever give a child to you? Each day you made such beautiful furniture, yet each night your hands had only ugliness for me. I would never give a child to your ugliness." Elizabeth saw to that outcome with her bitter potions, which I gladly drank. It is only passing strange to her that his death has freed her tongue to speak the endless grievances against him, all the things she could never say to him while he yet lived. She struggles with his weight, down the narrow staircase to the basement. If she is not careful, she could fall and break a limb or split her head open. Carelessness now will produce the same result as if she had shared the deadly draught with her husband. She grunts with effort, realizing with each step that she leaves traces of dust and wood splinters on his clothing, signs that he has been dragged. She will have to clean his jerkin and breeches. How many times has Elizabeth performed such dark chores? She asks herself, sweat beading her brow. Her heart pounds. Sunrise is still hours away, yet the thought of daylight's revelations fill her with sick fear. She has begun to appreciate the night, the concealing darkness. Here in the basement, the darkness is almost complete. She imagines Roland looking up at her, waiting for a careless moment to clutch her throat, to squeeze the life out of her as easily as water from a rag. One last beating. She runs upstairs for a candlestick. The fireplace hisses and spits its disapproval. Taking the long candlestick from the windowsill, she hurries to the Betty lamp, pulls its wick out with the chain pick, and lights her candle from the bare fat flame. A chill races up her spine, and a lump of dread makes its home in the pit of her stomach. What has she seen out of the corner of her eye? What movement? She looks over her shoulder, her mind filling with excuses never to be uttered. If she is caught now, she will not fight the accusations. The night knows all about her now. It knows the exact moment she stopped being the girl with the quick laughter and the moment when months of fear blossomed into a willingness to commit murder. Yes, the night knows Sarah Hutchins well. So be it. She turns around swiftly, prepared to meet her accuser. Shadows move across the banister-backed chair. Something rising? It is just her shadow, cast by the now higher flame of the Betty lamp. But she has faced down her own accusations, or so she thinks. Roland is waiting for her in the basement, lying beside the stone well, flat on his back, head hanging awkwardly to one side, one hand bent over his waist. Such large hands, she thinks. She had seen strength in them once. Now she knows them only as instruments of his brutality. She sets the portable candlestick beside her as she brushes the dust and wood splinters from his clothes. "When you go down the well, know my fate will not follow you," she whispers. In a few moments she is ready. She lowers the bucket first, hears water splash against the wood. Daylight will reveal that he fell trying to retrieve the bucket. She lifts him, first to a sitting position, then turning him over, pushing up, her arms under his legs. His arms and shoulders now hang over the pit. She will throw him in with enough force to crush his skull or break his neck against the side of the well. Otherwise, she must hope that it will appear he simply drowned in an unconscious stupor. She sucks in her breath, feels her arms and legs trembling with exhaustion and a residue of fear. With a grunt of effort, she heaves him over the edge, her fingernails clawing at his breeches. His body, free from her grasp, spins wildly, his foot nearly kicking her lip, narrowly missing her nose as he falls. His head strikes the stone with a heavy thud. Then she hears him crash the bucket as he lands on it. Water splashes up from the mouth of the well. The candle flame hisses, then dies. The darkness swallows her whole. She fights the urge to run upstairs and the equally strong urge to empty her stomach. Instead, she crawls on hands and knees, searching for the candlestick. She feels about blindly, her fingers sweeping across the floor, splinters of wood. His foot, standing before her. She screams, but it is only one of his shoes. She flings it into the well after him, then picks up the candle holder and hurries upstairs. Now am I truly free, Elizabeth, free to join you and Rebecca. Her voice is a tremulous whisper of self-reassurance. She knows she cannot turn back. Trembling, she curls up in the short jack bed, waiting for the sun to rise, clutching the linen sheets to her chest. I am finally free. Then she is plunged into darkness again. While Abby dreamed in the PICU, Karen sat shivering 4 floors below in a paper hospital gown in a forgotten corner of the ER where she'd spent most of the afternoon suffering the various scans and pricks and indignities of modern medical science. As if the humiliation of convulsing before an entire freshman class wasn't enough, Karen's day had included puking on the bumpy ambulance ride over, receiving a pelvic exam from a former student doing his obstetrics rotation in the ER, suffering the claustrophobic treat of MRI and CT scans, and painful impalement of an amniocentesis, and now wincing her way through the sixth blood test of the afternoon's latest trial, a glucose tolerance test. Ouch, she said without much conviction as the kid drawing blood, a third-year med student with shaky hands, missed her vein for the second time. Sorry, he explained sheepishly. This is my first day. He hit the vein on the third try, capped the vial, and scurried away. 30 minutes later, Maria Laballo, Karen's OB-GYN, appeared with the results of the final blood test in hand. Well, your pancreas is functioning perfectly. I just want to perform a quick ultrasound as a final precaution, and then I'll send you home to get something to eat. She rolled the portable ultrasound and monitor cart through the curtains that had been drawn around Karen's bed for privacy. Maria was a tiny woman, Filipino by birth, and yet she manhandled the cart with force. 5 minutes later, Maria began expertly maneuvering the transducer across Karen's jelly-slick abdomen. As always, the image that appeared on the monitor was murky and throbbing, an animate Rorschach test welcoming interpretation. It was possible to lose yourself in the rhythm of that heart-thrumming landscape, to peer so intently at the echoing contours of your own insides that you became mesmerized. So enwrapped was Karen in deciphering what she saw that she began to hear the accompanying soundtrack, hallucinating the agitated thrush-thumping percussion of the baby's amplified heart. And now she could see the child, her daughter, a grotesque thing suspended in the pixelated gloom, a goblin crouched within her, mouth open in a ravenous yawn. With a cry, she knocked the transducer free of Maria's hand. The ultrasound monitor went dark. Karen, it's okay. There's something wrong. Something is wrong with the baby. Maria put her hands on Karen's shoulder and held her until the panic had abated. Paul returned then from the cafeteria to find them like this, Karen crying, Maria hushing Karen with calming words in Tagalog, the language of her childhood. What's wrong? He said, his eyes going stony, preparing himself for the worst. She had a fright, Maria said. Everything's okay now. Karen clung to Maria's hand as the obstetrician began to pull away. What's wrong with the baby? Tell me. Nothing. The baby's heartbeat is strong. She's large for 24 weeks. She's going to be big like her father. Maria looked up at Paul, tall and awkward with the little tint of curtains, like a befuddled magician at a child's party. I don't believe you, Karen said. Paul kissed her and stroked the hair away from her forehead. She bristled, brushing him away. She didn't want to be touched, didn't want to be consoled like some crazy woman. Maria said, "You'll believe me when the test results of the amniocentesis come back in a few days." "What caused her seizure this morning, Doctor?" Paul asked. "That's going to remain one of the great unsolved mysteries," Maria said. "At this point, my money is on old-fashioned exhaustion." "She hasn't been sleeping," Paul said. "Bad dreams," Karen said. It was becoming her mantra. "Pregnancy demands a lot of a woman's body," Maria explained. "You've got a lot of hormones surging through you right now. Mixed with exhaustion, and you've got a pretty potent cocktail." She looked at both of them, asked them as a couple, "Have you been under a great deal of stress?" Karen exchanged a look with Paul. "Paul's brother was in a serious car accident earlier in the week. They think he's lost part of the vision in his right eye." Maria's face darkened. He is in this hospital?" Paul nodded. Karen tried to intercept the rumor before it found another convert. "What they're saying about Art and that little girl, it isn't true," Paul said. "The police interviewed me all afternoon yesterday. I tried to tell them." Maria nodded and said unconvincingly, "Of course." Karen could already see her reevaluating them because of their association with Art. She said, "The little girl's condition is very serious." "We're all praying for her," Paul said, and Karen frowned. It was such an unlikely thing for him to say that she felt a hot rush of anger at the world, at this community, for forcing him to say it. Maria nodded and gestured toward Karen. "She's had a long day. I'm afraid we've worn her out in our efforts to prove she's suffering exhaustion. You should take her home." Karen sensed a coolness in Maria's voice and resigned herself to it. She expected to hear a lot of it in the coming days. Even though it had already been an impossibly long day, Karen and Paul decided to extend it a bit longer and visit Art. Paul had already looked in on his older brother earlier in the day, updating him on Karen's seizure and learning on the sheriff's visit. Now, after convincing Art that Karen was all right following the seizure scare, they returned again to the topic of Art's arrest on suspicion of attempted rape. "They think I kidnapped that little girl," Art said, his voice trembling. "They think that I—" He began to break down, and Karen went to him, kissing his temple and calming him as she herself had been calmed only a little while earlier. "I've found a lawyer," Paul said. "Neil Katz. I filled him in on the situation, and he's agreed to represent you." "Why do I need a lawyer?" Art said miserably. "Because the little girl was found in your car. Because you've admitted to being alone with her in a secluded place in the woods. Because you've got scratches on your face made by a terrified child fighting for her life. Because she's paralyzed." "But I didn't do anything." "You're not listening to me. What do the police see when they look at you? A 40-year-old recluse with a ponytail, no wife and kids, not much of a job, that dope arrest still on your records from college. It isn't that big of a leap for them to start seeing you as a sexual predator." At that, Art recoiled with a horrified look. Paul didn't relent. "I'm sorry, but until that little girl starts talking, that's how they're going to keep seeing you. We can't be naive and assume they'll give you the benefit of the doubt just because you're a hometown boy. We've got to start protecting you, and that means no more talking to police without Neil Katz present." "But if I stop talking, it's like admitting I'm guilty." He turned from Paul's unrelenting gaze and searched out Karen. She gave his hand a squeeze. "Paul's right, sweetheart. They'll help you make your own noose if you let them." "I've got to get out of here," Art said, giving his head a violent shake. "Shit!" He put a hand to his bandages as he felt a searing white bolt of pain lance through his injured eye. "Do you want me to get a nurse?" Karen said. "Do you need more pain medication?" "I'm okay. It does this sometimes," Art said. Antibiotics, Art said, already beginning to absorb some of the jargon. "Pharmaceutical equivalent of an A-bomb. So far, this infection is resistant to everything they throw at it." "A staph infection?" Art shook his bandaged head. "They don't know what it is, but it came from under the little girl's fingernails." He cast a sidelong glance toward the nurse's station, and dropped his voice to a whisper. "I've been bribing an orderly to sneak me information on her status. He said the little girl's infected with it too. It's all through her." He tried a weak smile to cover how frightened he was. "Who knows where that kid's hands have been?" Karen felt Paul tugging on her sleeve, trying to draw her away from Art's bedside. "Hun, maybe you shouldn't sit so close. The baby." Art said, "Don't worry. Apparently you can only contract it through direct blood contact." He fell silent. Paul paced to the window. "What happened out there, Art? Do you have any idea?" "She was running away," Art said quietly. "The graveyard she found was her hiding place. She felt safe there. That might sound creepy to you or me, but she's just a kid. She hasn't learned to be afraid of death yet. Hell, she probably saw the word witch on those headstones, and the first thing that came to mind was Tabitha, not Margaret Hamilton." "What do you mean, witch?" Karen said, feeling discomfort at the mention of the word. Art looked surprised. "Didn't Paul tell you?" He turned to the bedside table where a photo lab envelope rested among magazines. He shuffled through the 5x7 glossies, singling out several for Karen. "The police let me keep them after they saw there were no kiddie porn shots in the roll. Of course, they kept the negatives." As Karen flipped through the close-ups of the gravestones, Art explained, "I always assumed they were buried in an unmarked grave somewhere, but here they are, the infamous Wendell Three: Elizabeth Wither, Sarah Hutchins, and Rebecca Cole." Karen's thoughts blotted out Art's words, the name resonating in her mind as she held the gravestone bearing that name in trembling fingers. Her eyes grew distant, and for a moment she seemed to drop sideways out of the flow of time. Her expression, blank, unseeing, was enough to alarm Paul, but by the time he reached for her she was back, the world's unspooling ribbon of film finding its sprocket again with a sharp snap into sync. She shivered, fighting a wave of nausea. "I'm sorry, Are you okay?" Paul said. "Are you going to be sick?" No, I'm fine now," Karen said, lying for his sake. "Just lightheaded for a moment." Art was watching her curiously. Something in her reaction puzzled him, and he wondered if it had anything to do with her colonial dreams. "Karen?" "Saying their names just makes them seem so real," Karen said. The room seemed to have gotten darker and airless. Later that night, as the night float nursing staff began hanging paper Halloween decorations all along the pediatric wards, and the ER's on-call residents dealt with a violent addict convinced him he'd seen monsters in the moonlight skies above Wendell, Art's doctors met over their sleeping patient's bed to discuss his prognosis. The infection in his right eye was proving stubbornly resilient to the broad-spectrum antibiotics they had ordered. The fear among the surgeons was that the microbe would begin to spread from the eye to surrounding structures and even the brain. It was the opinion of the chief surgeon, Dr. Phelan, that if the spread of the infection could not be checked within the next 48 hours, the patient should again undergo surgery to have the damaged eye and infected tissues entirely excised. The gathering of serious men disbanded, satisfied that an appropriate course of action had been determined. The patient would lose his right eye but would keep his life, and for that, frankly, he should be grateful, as it was the unspoken opinion of Dr. Phelan and his colleagues that this particular patient deserved no better. In this they were unanimous, but then all four doctors were the fathers of young daughters. And it's now time for another coffee break.